Hey guys, so today we're going to be spending some time talking about the Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. So you're going to be on 2 pages of your packet. So you first will be on the Ronald Reagan page up at the top there, and then you are going to be on the H.W. Bush page right here, which is the next page. I know it looks like a lot, but we're going to go through it pretty quick. So Ronald Reagan comes to office in a time where America is really frustrated. The 70s were a period of turmoil for America. Jimmy Carter had seemed like this promise to fix things, and it just seemed like things were getting worse under Jimmy Carter's administration. So when Ronald Reagan comes in promising this New Deal for Americans, people are really excited about it. And so when Reagan is running for office in 1979, first of all, he was an actor in Hollywood. So a lot of people knew a lot about him already. He'd already kind of made a name for himself, went on to become governor of California, and he just seemed like the opposite of Carter, somebody who could get something done. So in terms of his style, right, Ronald Reagan was a very good-natured kind of guy. He could crack a joke about himself. He's seen as kind of this man's man, like you see the cowboy persona there. As I said before, he is an actor, which means he can play a role. He also is a great communicator for that. He knows how to public speak, he knows how to talk to people, he knows how to make people laugh, and people really like him for it. Not to mention that he actually was seen kind of as a Superman. There was an assassination attempt on him, which he survived. Not only did he survive, he actually was like joking with the doctors after he'd been shot. He said something about how he hoped the surgeon was a Republican and not a Democrat, right? This kind of made him seem like this heroic, infallible, like invincible kind of person. And so Ronald Reagan's ideas, he was a real conservative Republican, right? So he believed in small government, in lower taxes, and traditional ideas. So those are the 3 central points of any conservative, and those are the 3 that he really stuck to. So let's talk through some of these ideas first. So first of all, he believed in cutting the budget and trying to get rid of some of the things he thought were unnecessary. Now, he doesn't cut Medicare, Social Security. The elderly are like a key support group, so he can't really do anything to them. He does make some cuts to welfare programs, but at other places, he doesn't really cut a lot of spending, especially in terms of defense. He actually increases spending in terms of defense. And this is also a period where there's a lot of social problems in America at the time. There's a lot of homelessness, AIDS, crack cocaine has become kind of a big problem. Low-income areas are really suffering. This is also the area where rap music starts to become a big thing, and it's kind of there to talk about some of the issues of the day as well. Now, he also, not only does he propose budget cuts, he also proposes tax cuts. So one of the things he does is cut taxes across the board 25%. So he believes in something called supply side or trickle down economics. It's also called Reaganomics, is how you'll hear it described sometimes. And basically the idea is if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they have more money. And if they have more money, they're going to spend it. And when they spend money, it creates jobs. And when they create jobs, the poor people can get jobs and their work is rewarded and everybody's economy gets better. This is still a big part of conservative philosophy in terms of economics. A lot of people argue that it doesn't really work all that well, that rich people just kind of hoard their money. But this is really still something that conservatives believe is a big problem. The issue is because he's cutting the budget, or not cutting the budget enough, and cutting taxes, it leads to a massive debt problem. So he doesn't cut enough spending, and the result is massive debt. Now, it's really going to come back to bite him a little bit, or come back to bite the nation after Reagan is presidency. It's going to kind of leave George Bush to deal with that. But this is going to cause a major issue for the economy of America in the 90s. He also, at this time, appoints 3 justices to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, up until this point, had been a pretty liberal court, but he decides to appoint 3 more conservative justices, and Anton Scalia, who you may have heard of. We have Anthony Kennedy, and then our first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. That should say Sandra Day O'Connor, so make sure you write that down. So this is his domestic policy. And as you can see, like I said, the problem of not cutting budget enough is really going to cause a major issue. Probably the craziest thing that he came up with is something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, also nicknamed Star Wars. Star Wars had just come out in theaters at the end of the 70s, so that's kind of where it gets its nickname from. So this is going to be a massive spending hike on defense. And it was basically a plan to develop a space-based satellite system to shoot nuclear weapons out of the sky with lasers. If it sounds kind of weird, it's because it is. So first of all, you should know that this is all Ronald Reagan. He basically came to his scientists and were like, hey, scientist, make this happen. It is not rooted in science at all. It's a major problem. So you can look at it here. So we've got the ground-based laser, and the laser bounces off a mirror in the sky, and the mirrors have space-based surveillance tracking, and then they can shoot the threat out. And yeah, it's kind of weird looking, right? And it should be. Scientists are like, Mr. President, we can't do this. This is not a thing. We can't make this happen. But funnily enough, it kind of works, right? So the problem is the Soviets didn't know we couldn't do it, and it scared them. They thought we had the technology, and they're like, there's no way we can compete with this technology. Like, what are we going to do? And so the Soviets get scared. It leads them to negotiate with the United States. It leads to reforms taking place. And eventually, it's going to lead to the end of the Cold War. So even though this really wacky idea come up with by a president who had no scientific knowledge at all, it kind of works. Like, yay, I guess. Yeah, it's weird, I know. But hey, whatever works, I guess. So in terms of other foreign policy, what he really believed is in something called peace through strength, right? So what he does here is he basically wants to show the Soviet Union that we are the biggest and the baddest, right? And so he's going to show them that we are going to force them to surrender so the Cold War ends. So he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, right? And the Soviet Union was led at the time by a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Reagan and Gorbachev actually met a couple times and kind of negotiated. Gorbachev had instituted some reforms in the Soviet Union, namely glasnost and perestroika. So glasnost means openness. So it was like freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which had not existed in the Soviet Union. And then he instituted some economic reforms that looked a lot more like capitalism than it looked like communism. They also signed the INF Treaty, which limits nuclear weapons and allows for on-site inspections. Between all of these things, we're going to see the Soviet Union starting to crumble a little bit. And by the time Reagan is out of office, the Soviet Union is almost over. And so we are winning the Cold War, essentially. Now, in terms of Latin America, we also had some pretty major issues, mainly with Nicaragua. So this is something called the Iran-Contra affair. So Reagan wanted to stop communism in Nicaragua. Communism is starting to spread, and he don't want it in Latin America, right? So there is a group in Nicaragua called the Contras, and they are the anti-communist guerrilla group in Nicaragua, okay? So Congress had been funding them, but they decided to cut off funding to the Contras through something called the Boland Amendment. So they're like, we're not going to give you money anymore because we don't want to do this, okay? Well, Reagan still wants to give money to the Contras. So what they do is secretly sell weapons to Iran in order to raise money. So what Reagan does is secretly sells weapons to Iran in order to raise money to fund the Contras, right? Now, if this seems sketchy, it's because it was. Now, I should point out, Ronald Reagan claimed he knew nothing about it, and it's probably true. He probably didn't know. But he actually kind of gets away with it. The Reagan administration gets away with it. This is where he earns his nickname, the Teflon president. So Teflon is like something that goes in like pots and pans that prevents things from sticking to them. So basically they're saying nothing sticks to Reagan. Reagan is very successful. He actually wins the presidency twice. He wins in a landslide in his second term in 1984, goes on to serve 8 years, and the country thinks everything's looking great. And because of the success of Reagan, they decide to elect George H.W. Bush. So sorry about this last one down here I forgot about. So in 1983, he actually invades Grenada in order to prevent a communist coup. So that's just another example of the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America. So in 1989, George H.W. Bush, 41, is elected president. So he had been Ronald Reagan's VP, and he is going to go on to try and attempt to fill in Ronald Reagan's shoes. We'll see how well he does, right? So first of all, we have the fall of communism. So close to the end of Reagan's administration and the beginning of Bush's administration, many of the socialist Soviet republics, so the countries controlled by the Soviet Union, had started to break away. Georgia, Turkmenistan, Yugoslavia, all these places. And in 1991, Russia, or the Soviet Union falls, and Russia is established with Boris Yeltsin as president. The Berlin Wall also comes down in 1989. So that was a really big symbol of kind of Soviet control. So that's a really big deal as well. East and West Germany are reunited for the first time since the 1960s. The problem is Bush inherits some problems from Ronald Reagan. Now, when he was running for office, he promised not to raise taxes, right? Read my lips, no new taxes, right? Then the problem is, read my lips, no new taxes. He compromised with Congress in order to raise taxes. Now, this was actually probably a good move. He needed to, solve some of the economic problems. Raising taxes was going to do that. He agreed not to raise them too much. He got some stuff out of it with Congress. The American people didn't see it that way. They saw a president who went back on his promises. Also, the banks had been deregulated and the banks were starting to fail. So a bank bailout cost billions of dollars. Republicans are not usually into bank bailouts. So these two things really kind of frustrate the Republican Party, who had elected him on the hope that he wouldn't do these things. But the problem was the economy was so bad, he had to do these things, right? Also, the Iran-Contra affair started to get more light during this time. So the scandal really caused some problems. He pardons all of the people involved, all those who were indicted or convicted. And that just seems a little sketchy. People are not okay with that. And so that kind of gives him a bad name as well. In terms of foreign policy, Reagan and Bush fight something that they called the war on drugs. So basically, the short story here is that drugs had become a major problem in the United States in the 70s and 80s, and they're trying to cut back on them. So the president of Panama is a guy named Manuel Noriega, and he is overseeing drug sales from Panama to the United States. So he is helping to smuggle drugs into our country, and that's majorly illegal, right? Bush didn't want anything to do with that. So we actually invade Panama and arrest their president. We bring him back to Florida and sentence him to 40 years in jail. Wow, that's major. That's really major intervention from the United States. Here is his mugshot from Florida. And so the president of another country that we've arrested and sentenced in our country in order to try and prevent drugs from coming in. Now, in terms of communism, in 1989, there was a revolt in China called the Tiananmen Square Revolt. The Chinese youth had tried to overthrow communism in China. It is, however, put down by force. You see this photograph here is a very famous photograph. That is a protester that the tanks are about to run over. To answer your question, yes, they do. So this kind of damages our relationship with China a little bit. However, China does start to make some reforms and eventually become looking a lot more capitalist than they do communist. The biggest issue that we have under George Bush is some trouble in Iraq. So Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, invades the nearby area of Kuwait in order to get oil reserves. We decide to defend Kuwait, the hope being that we can get some of that oil. So this leads to Operation Desert Storm. So it is a United Nations coalition force that's led by the United States. It starts in January of 1991. It does not take long. We defeat Iraq in less than 5 days with 400 casualties. So not much at all. It was a pretty easy. The problem is Saddam Hussein is defeated, but we don't take him out of power, right? Bush decides not to take him out. That's going to lead to some problems under Bush's son, George W. Bush, when he becomes president. So in terms of the legacy or the evaluation of Bush the Elder, he was probably one of the best presidents we ever had. Problem is he was underappreciated in his time. He was seen as too compromising when actually that looked pretty wise now. His decision not to overthrow Saddam Hussein now looks wise, even though at the time people saw it as a problem. The biggest issue was Bush was burdened with a bad economy. And so when he runs for re-election in 1992, too many people thought that he had broken his promise and they are going to elect William Clinton, better known as Bill Clinton, as the next president. So I know that was a lot of information given to you really quick, but I hope that you learned something here. Until next time, I'll see you later.